The moon doesn't feel like home. It never could. Even with all our innovations, all our genius crammed into this domed colony, it remains an indifferent, alien rock. When I first stepped onto the surface of Artemis 1, gazing out at the endless grey regolith under a black sky, I felt it in my chest, a kind of primal loneliness, like staring at the void of creation itself. It's a loneliness that lingers, despite the vibrations of gravcore and the comforting illusion of gravity beneath my boots. Still, loneliness is better than noise. Back on Earth, there was too much of it, too many people, too much chaos. Here, I could at least think. Maybe that's why I volunteered for this mission. I told myself it was for science, for the opportunity to study the moon's tectonic secrets, but the truth is simpler. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to escape. Now, even here, I can't escape the sound of progress. Gravcore had just been activated, and the entire base buzzed with energy. Through my office window, I could see technicians bustling around the main habitat like bees in a hive, their suits shimmering under the harsh floodlights. Beneath them, deep within the crust, the Gravcore chamber beat like a mechanical heart. I sipped the bitter excuse for coffee we brewed from algae extract and sighed. Gravcore was impressive, no question. A device capable of creating localized gravity on the moon was nothing short of revolutionary. It promised to change everything: easier mining operations, safer construction, even the possibility of true lunar cities. And yet, as I stared at the seismic data on my tablet, I felt a pang of unease. The first tremor had been small, a blip on the sensors. I'd double-checked the equipment, recalibrated the sensors, and still, it persisted. The moon wasn't supposed to behave this way. Its seismic activity was sporadic, chaotic. This was intentional. Later that evening, I brought the data to Dr. Margaret Ellis. She was working at a terminal in the Gravcore control room, her silver hair tied back in a practical knot. Ellis had the kind of intensity that could make you feel both inspired and inadequate. She wasn't just brilliant, she was visionary. The kind of person who could make you believe in impossible things. "Dr. Tate," she greeted without looking up. "You've brought me more bad news, I assume." I hesitated, holding out my tablet. It's not necessarily bad, but it's unusual. Ellis finally turned her attention to me, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she studied the data. "This isn't unexpected," she said at last, her tone dismissive. "Gravcore is introducing forces the moon has never experienced. Some minor disruptions are inevitable. With all due respect, Dr. Ellis, this isn't minor. These tremors are rhythmic, almost structured. Something is responding." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Responding? You make it sound alive." I flinched at the word. "Not alive, no, but this isn't random. It warrants further investigation." She waved me off, turning back to her terminal. "The moon is a dynamic system, Ethan. We're introducing variables it hasn't encountered in billions of years. Of course, there will be anomalies, but this project is bigger than one blip on your sensors. Gravcore is the future of human expansion into space. Don't lose sight of that." Her words lingered with me as I left the control room. Bigger than one blip, bigger than me, bigger than the moon itself. But as I returned to my lab, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was underestimating the significance of what we'd triggered. The next tremor came 2 days later. This time, it wasn't subtle. It rattled the entire habitat, knocking over instruments and sending an eerie vibration through the walls. I was in the middle of analyzing core samples when it hit, and I nearly dropped my tablet. My heart stopped. Lunar structures aren't designed for earthquakes. I rushed to the command center, where Captain Samuel Dalton was already barking orders. Dalton was a solid, no-nonsense man who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too much. He'd been a soldier before this, a career that left him with a limp and a permanent frown. "Dr. Tate," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What the hell is going on?" "I'm still trying to figure that out," I admitted, pulling up the seismic data on the main screen. The tremors are increasing in intensity, and they're centered near the Gravcore chamber. This isn't normal lunar activity. Can you stop it? It's not that simple. If this is related to Gravcore, shutting it down might not solve the problem. It could even make things worse. Dalton muttered a curse, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. Ellis needs to hear this. When we found her, she was already deep in conversation with Earth Command. The video feed showed a row of executives in suits, their expressions a mix of impatience and concern. Ellis listened to them with the practiced calm of someone used to defending her vision. "We're aware of the situation," she said, her tone firm but diplomatic. "Our team is analyzing the data, and we're confident the tremors can be managed. Shutting down Gravcore isn't an option at this stage. The risks to the colony's infrastructure outweigh the benefits." I wanted to interrupt, to argue, but Dalton gave me a look that stopped me in my tracks. When Ellis finally ended the call, she turned to us with an exasperated sigh. "Well," she demanded, "what's so urgent?" Dalton gestured to me, and I approached reluctantly. "Dr. Ellis, the tremors are escalating. This isn't just a side effect, it's a systemic issue. We need to suspend Gravcore operations until we understand what's happening." "And jeopardize the entire mission." Her voice rose. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here?" "With all due respect, what's at stake is the integrity of the moon's crust. If these tremors continue, we could see fractures that compromise the colony, and worse." Her expression hardened. "You're overreacting." "I don't think I am," I insisted. "The moon's structure is fragile. It wasn't meant to handle this kind of sustained gravitational manipulation." She didn't respond immediately. For a moment I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she shook her head. "I appreciate your concerns, Dr. Tate, but this project is bigger than your fears. I'll authorize further seismic studies, but Gravcore remains operational." That night I couldn't sleep. The tremors had stopped for the moment, but it felt like we'd crossed a line. As I lay in my bunk, staring at the glow of the habitat's emergency lights, I found myself thinking about the myths I'd read as a child. Stories of gods and monsters buried deep within the earth, waiting to awaken. It was a ridiculous thought. This was the moon, not some ancient battleground of deities. But the tremors, the strange dreams I'd been having since Gravcore's activation, they wore down my rational mind. I dreamt of falling again that night, falling into a dark void surrounded by crystalline structures. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream. It had to be. The next morning, I received a report from one of the mining crews. They'd found something unusual in the fissures near Gravcore, a series of glowing crystalline formations. The crew leader described them as beautiful, but unsettling. I suited up and joined the team at the excavation site. The fissures were wide, rough cracks that snaked across the lunar surface like scars. As I approached, I saw the crystals for myself. Tall, sharp spires that shimmered under the harsh light of our lamps. "What do you make of it?" one of the miners asked. The formations were something I had never witnessed before, their surfaces covered in complex designs that appeared carefully planned. I reached out to touch one, but stopped myself. Something about them felt off. "We need samples," I said finally, "and detailed scans of the area. Whatever this is, it's connected to the tremors." As I watched them, I felt the faintest pull, a compulsion to move closer, to reach out. I forced myself to step back, shaking off the strange sensation. Something was happening beneath the moon's surface. Something we'd awakened, and I wasn't sure we could stop it. The following week went by in a rush of tension. The tremors continued, their intensity growing. My seismic data revealed a disturbing pattern. The source was no longer localized around Gravcore. The rhythmic waves were spreading outward, resonating through the lunar crust like ripples in a pond. Something was moving beneath us, and I had no doubt that Gravcore had set it in motion. One morning, as I was analyzing the latest data, a miner burst into the lab. His eyes were wide with something between fear and disbelief. "Dr. Tate, you need to come to Site 3, he said, breathless. I didn't ask questions. Grabbing my gear, I followed him to the excavation site. The fissures had widened since my last visit, now resembling deep canyons that snaked across the lunar surface. As we descended into one of the largest cracks, I noticed something new. The walls of the fissure were lined with more of the crystalline structures. "It wasn't like this yesterday," the miner muttered. "They're spreading." At the bottom of the fissure, I approached one of the larger crystals, examining its patterns under the beam of my headlamp. The etchings weren't random. They formed a complex geometric design that seemed intentional. I scanned the structure with my handheld analyzer, but the readings made no sense. The crystals emitted electromagnetic signals, fluctuating in time with the tremors. "This isn't natural," I whispered. "It can't be." That night, the tremors escalated to a level we'd never seen before. The entire colony shook, cracks appearing in the walls of the main habitat. Captain Dalton and his security team scrambled to assess the damage, while I raced to the control room to analyze the latest seismic data. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The epicenter of the activity was no longer near Gravcore. It had shifted deep beneath the fissures to a location I hadn't identified before. I overlaid the data onto a topographical map of the moon and realized something chilling. The tremors were converging on a single point far beneath the surface. "We need to shut Gravcore down," I told Ellis, who stood rigidly at the control panel, her face lit by the glow of the monitors. She shook her head. "Shutting it down now could destabilize the system completely. We'd risk a gravitational collapse." "We're risking that already," I countered. "Whatever's happening down there, Gravcore is feeding it. We're making it stronger." A sudden roar shook the entire base. The lights dimmed, and for a moment I thought the habitat was going to collapse. Dalton's voice crackled over the intercom, ordering an evacuation of the lower levels. I ran to the observation deck, where I had a clear view of the surface. What I saw made my stomach drop. A massive crystalline spire had erupted from the ground near the fissures. It towered over the surrounding landscape. "It's growing," I whispered. The emergence of the spire sent shockwaves, both literal and metaphorical, through the colony. The crew was on edge, and tensions boiled over as we debated our next steps. Ellis was adamant about keeping Gravcore operational, arguing that it was our only chance to stabilize the situation. Dalton, however, sided with me, insisting that the risks were too great. "This isn't just a geological event," I said during a heated meeting in the command center. "The crystals are emitting signals, structured signals. Whatever's down there, it's intelligent." "That's a leap," Ellis countered, her tone icy. "We don't have enough data to make that claim." "Open your eyes, Margaret," I said, slamming my fist on the table. "Those crystals aren't natural. They're spreading, growing, and now they're erupting from the ground. Gravcore disrupted something ancient, and we don't know what it's capable of. We can't afford to panic. If we abandon Gravcore now, everything we've built here will be for nothing." Dalton stepped in before the argument could escalate further. "Enough. We need to focus on protecting this colony. Ethan, you said the signals are structured. Can we interpret them?" "It's possible. If we can isolate the patterns, we might be able to understand what it's trying to communicate." "Then do it," Dalton ordered. "We need answers." Over the next few days, I immersed myself in the task of deciphering the signals from the crystals. The data was a bewildering puzzle, a complex interplay of gravitational fluctuations and electromagnetic pulses. At first glance, it appeared random, but the more I studied it, the more I detected a structured rhythm. The signals followed a pattern, almost like an algorithm cycling through iterations. I enlisted a small team of mathematicians and engineers from the colony, turning the lab into a war room of equations, algorithms, and simulation models. We ran analysis after analysis, trying to break down the signals into something recognizable. It wasn't language in the conventional sense. There were no words or phrases, but it had a kind of grammar, repetition, variation, escalation. "It's almost like music," one of the engineers, Carter, remarked as we examined the waveforms on a monitor. I nodded, though I didn't fully agree. Music implies beauty, intent to inspire or connect. What we were looking at felt colder, more functional, like the inner workings of an alien machine. Still, it was structured, and structure meant we might find a way to communicate. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a late-night session, Carter isolated a subset of the signals, a repeating motif that seemed to shift in response to environmental variables like seismic activity and magnetic field changes. It was reactive, which suggested it could be interactive. "We can send something back," he said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. "Mimic this subset. See if it responds." The idea was risky, but we were running out of options. If the signals were reactive, there was a chance the entity might interpret our attempt as an intrusion or a threat. Using parts scavenged from the colony's communication arrays and GravCore's diagnostic systems, we constructed a crude transmitter capable of generating gravitational pulses. The device was far from perfect, its range was limited, and its output was a fraction of what the crystals seemed to emit. But it was enough to simulate a basic response. The next challenge was deciding what to say. Without a shared context or frame of reference, our options were limited. We settled on a simple approach, replicating the entity's own signals, then introducing slight variations to convey the concept of intent. It was like tapping on a door in a rhythm and waiting for an answer. The device was set up near one of the larger fissures, close enough for the signals to reach the crystalline spires without risking further destabilization of the surrounding area. As we activated it, I felt a tense anticipation, like standing on the edge of a precipice. "First sequence ready," Carter announced. "Sending. Now." The transmitter emitted a low-frequency gravitational pulse, perfectly mimicking the motif we'd isolated. We watched the monitors in silence, waiting for a response. The crystals began to shimmer, their surfaces shifting as if reacting to the disturbance. "It's working," someone whispered. Motivated, we sent the second sequence, introducing a slight variation, a calculated deviation meant to signal the presence of a conscious actor. This time, the response was immediate. The seismic activity spiked, and the crystals brightened, emitting a series of pulses that dwarfed our own. "They're answering," I said, my voice filled with awe. For the next hour, we engaged in a crude form of call and response. Each time we sent a signal, the crystals responded with increasingly complex patterns. It felt like progress, but it also felt wrong. The responses were escalating, not stabilizing. The seismic readings showed growing intensity with every exchange, as if the entity's movements beneath the surface were amplifying. Then we made a critical mistake. Carter suggested introducing a new sequence, a more complex variation that combined elements of the previous signals with additional layers of frequency. The idea was to demonstrate higher-order intelligence, to show that we weren't just mimicking, but innovating. It was a bold move, and in hindsight, it was reckless. When the new sequence was transmitted, the response was immediate and violent. The ground shook with a force that sent us stumbling. On the monitors, the seismic activity soared to an extreme. Cracks widened in the fissures, and new ones began to form around the transmitter. The crystalline spires shifted as if they were stretching or expanding beyond three-dimensional space. The entity wasn't just responding anymore. It was active, its signals overwhelming our sensors and spreading beyond the fissures. GravCore's systems began to fluctuate wildly, unable to compensate for the sudden surge of gravitational energy. We retreated to the command center, where Ellis was already reviewing the data. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger. "We tried to communicate," I admitted, knowing how it sounded now. "It responded, but we underestimated its reaction." "Underestimated?" She gestured to the monitors, where the seismic activity was spiraling out of control. "You provoked it. I thought it might help us understand." "Well, congratulations," she snapped. "Now we understand that it sees us as a threat." Dalton stepped in before the argument could escalate further. "What's done is done. The question is, what do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. The attempt to communicate had only made things worse. The entity's activity was spreading, its signals becoming stronger with every passing moment. The crystalline structures were proliferating, and GravCore's stability was deteriorating rapidly. As I stared at the data, a terrible realization dawned on me. The entity wasn't just reacting to GravCore, it was feeding on it. The gravitational pulses we'd introduced to the moon had awakened something vast, and now it was using that energy to grow. I turned to the others, my voice low but firm. It's not just responding to GravCore, it's feeding on it. Captain Dalton's head snapped toward me, his expression hardening as he processed the implication. If it's feeding on GravCore, we have to cut it off. No! Ellis's voice was sharp, immediate. Shutting GravCore down risks destabilizing the entire colony and the moon itself. We've seen what happens when the system fluctuates. A sudden cessation of power would be like yanking the foundation out from under a skyscraper. We don't have a choice, Dalton said. It's not just the colony at risk. If this thing destabilizes the moon's crust— I'm aware, Ellis interrupted, her tone icy. But we're not at that point yet. Not if we can contain it. I wanted to believe her, but the data told another story. The entity's activity was escalating exponentially. Each new seismic pulse it sent out was stronger than the last, rippling outward like the shockwave of a bomb. And those pulses weren't just staying on the moon. Earth was already feeling the effects. Reports from ground control described rising tides, erratic gravitational anomalies, and unusual electromagnetic disturbances. If we didn't act soon, this wouldn't just be a lunar disaster, it would be planetary. As the argument raged in the command center, I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me. This wasn't about equations or theories or the ambition of humankind. This was survival, ours and maybe everyone else's. And the solution wasn't clear. Ellis pulled me aside as Dalton continued to coordinate evacuation drills with his team. Ethan, you're the only one who truly understands the entity. If we shut down GravCore, we might cause a collapse. But if we keep it running— She trailed off, looking at me expectantly. Then we keep feeding it, I said, finishing the thought she couldn't bring herself to say. It'll keep growing. But there has to be another way. You've been studying it. You know its signals, its rhythms. There has to be something we can do to disrupt it. Her voice was desperate, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Ellis wasn't just fighting for GravCore anymore. She was fighting to hold together the fragile threads of a dream. A vision of humanity expanding into the stars, unshackled from the limits of Earth. And now, that dream was unraveling. Desperation drove us to one last, audacious plan. If the entity was feeding on GravCore's energy, then perhaps we could turn that energy against it. Using GravCore's immense power, we could attempt to create a containment field, a temporary bubble of stabilized gravity that might isolate the entity long enough for the colony to evacuate. Ellis and I worked through the night, modifying GravCore's parameters to generate the field. It wasn't designed for this kind of precision. GravCore was a hammer, not a scalpel, and we were trying to use it to perform brain surgery. Every adjustment carried the risk of destabilizing the system further. But there was no alternative. By dawn, we were ready. The plan was simple in theory, though terrifying in execution. GravCore would emit a concentrated gravitational pulse, creating a localized zone of increased pressure. This would, in theory, force the entity back into dormancy, or at least stop it from spreading. In the GravCore control chamber, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Technicians crowded around their stations, their faces drawn. Ellis stood at the central console, her hand hovering over the activation switch. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but heavy. "If this doesn't work—" She didn't finish the thought. As the countdown began, I watched the monitors intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The seismic readings were through the roof. The spires had grown larger, their forms stretching toward the sky. "GravCore stable," Carter reported. "Brace for impact." The moment GravCore activated, the entire colony seemed to lurch. A deep, bone-rattling vibration coursed through the floor, and the lights flickered as the gravitational pulse rippled outward. On the monitors, I saw the containment field take shape. a shimmering bubble of distorted space that enveloped the fissures and the crystalline spires. At first, it seemed to work. The seismic activity slowed, the spires stopped growing, and the signals from the crystals began to weaken. For a brief, exhilarating moment, I thought we'd done it. Then everything went wrong. The containment field wasn't holding. The entity was fighting back, its signals spiking in intensity as it pushed against the boundaries of the field. GravCore's systems strained under the load, warning lights flashing across the control panel. As the containment field began to fracture, the seismic activity surged. The fissures widened, the spires grew brighter, and a deep vibration filled the air. GravCore's systems were overloading, and we were out of time. "Evacuate the colony," Dalton ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The technicians scrambled to comply, abandoning their stations and racing for the escape pods. Ellis hesitated, her hands still on the controls, her eyes fixed on the failing containment field. "Margaret," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We have to go." She shook her head. "If we leave now, GravCore will overload. The whole moon could collapse." "Then shut it down remotely," I said, though I knew it was futile. The system was already past the point of no return. Ellis finally tore herself away from the console, following me and Dalton as we joined the evacuation. The escape pods were crowded and chaotic, the crew cramming in with desperate urgency. As our pod launched into the void, I looked back at the moon, my stomach twisting with relief and dread. From the observation window, I could see the containment field collapsing completely. The spires erupted in a blinding light, their forms disintegrating into a cascade of crystalline shards that rained down onto the surface. The fissures widened further, spreading like veins across the moon's face. And then, silence. The moon hung in the blackness of space, battered but intact. Back on Earth, the consequences of our failure were immediate. The gravitational anomalies caused by the entity's activity continued to wreak havoc, destabilizing tides and triggering earthquakes. The moon's structure was permanently compromised, its surface scarred by the entity's emergence. Scientists speculated that it might take decades or even centuries for the effects to stabilize. But the worst came later. In the following weeks, the entity's signals began to ripple through Earth's atmosphere. They were weak at first, mere anomalies detected by satellites and observatories, but they became stronger, affecting multiple systems. Power grids failed unpredictably. Communication networks faltered. Devices built to harness Earth's electromagnetic field began to behave strangely, as though something were rewriting the laws they depended on. At first, it was easy to dismiss as aftershocks, a natural consequence of the moon's destabilization. But then, astronomers noticed something terrifying. The signals weren't just being emitted from the moon. They were spreading outward, into space, carried by gravitational waves that extended beyond our solar system. 3 months after the evacuation, the first of the spires appeared on Earth. It rose in the middle of a desolate plain in the Gobi Desert, emerging overnight without warning. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual in the days prior, and seismic monitors registered no disturbances. Yet there it was, a towering structure of crystal, identical to the spires we'd seen on the moon. It emitted the same gravitational and electromagnetic signals we'd detected months earlier. Within hours of its discovery, localized gravitational anomalies began to ripple outward, affecting nearby regions. Water levels in nearby rivers fluctuated inexplicably. Buildings tilted on their foundations. Insects and birds abandoned the area en masse. And then it happened again and again. Spires appeared in the Andes, in the Siberian tundra, in the depths of the Pacific Ocean. Each one was larger than the last, their signals stronger, more disruptive. It was as though the entity had found new ground to spread its influence, new soil to grow in. It wasn't confined to the moon anymore. The scientific community scrambled to make sense of it, but the explanations felt hollow. Some suggested that the entity was terraforming Earth for its purposes, reshaping the planet to suit its inscrutable needs. Others believed it was a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The spires didn't appear to be attacking, but their presence was destabilizing nonetheless. Entire regions became uninhabitable as gravitational anomalies spread. Coastal cities flooded as tides rose unpredictably. Earth's magnetic field began to weaken, throwing weather patterns into chaos. Crops failed. Power grids collapsed. In the end, I left the Institute. The meetings, the questions, the empty reassurances, it was all too much. I retreated to a remote cabin far from the spires, far from the chaos, though even here I wasn't truly free. The signals still reached me, vibrating in the air like a distant drumbeat. I spent my days writing, trying to make sense of everything we'd seen, everything we'd done. Not as a scientist, but as a witness. The moon had been our first step outward, the beginning of humanity's expansion into the stars. But instead of finding new frontiers, we'd uncovered something ancient, something that dwarfed us in scope and scale. And the signals weren't stopping. If anything, they were becoming stronger, echoing outward into the cosmos. At times, I felt as though they were being heard not just by Earth, but by something else. Something far away. Humanity had reached into the void, and the void had reached back. The spires were only the beginning.